So this is the flip side of that whole thing. When you're delivering end to end, it does mean that we can keep iterating, but it is kind of nice to be able to say, well, it was all that other person's fault. And this one probably should feel appropriate for our content strategists. Our authors don't know how to author the staying site, right? Or maintain it, or be able to use workflows or promote it or anything like that. So a common problem, especially if you're getting to the end and everybody's got to ramp up their authoring in about a week before you go live. Hopefully, actually. One of the common ones I run into SEO, we need to have one H1 tag on this site, so we need to go back after and change a whole bunch of components and templates because they allow 2 or don't have any at all. And then finally, our DAM is a mess. So this is especially fun where you come in and see, well, this is the 3rd time we've done a DAM implementation, and oh, by the way, it's a mess again. So all these problems really kind of stem from a couple things from what I've seen, and it's about a lack of understanding of the overall life cycle. So you end up shortchanging things, you end up not including people, and so that's really what this talk is what is that life cycle? What does it take to go from I have Word documents and plans and spreadsheets and all that stuff to I have a live website, right? And it's going to be a little bit less technical because we're talking about things that are more process oriented and about how as developers what we need to look at, what are the pitfalls. So a lot of this stems from what I'm exaggerating a bit, but to call the salesperson project plan, right? So you have an easy content authoring tool, right? You picked AEM, it's great for content authoring, it really is. It's by far one of the best platforms. If you're using Drupal, anything like that, it's just so painless to author. And it just works out of the box, which is, by the way, I think number 2 or 3 least favorite phase of, in the world there for me. Means you'll get your website tomorrow, right? So, obviously an exaggeration, but we do it too. I know I do it. You look at something and you say, well, that's easy. Content strategy, right? You just draw a bunch of boxes and that's your site map. It's not that easy. Same thing with design. One of the things I actually found when I was doing this talk, I sat down with a number of people, and one of the revelations for me is that the designers, the way that they look at their production, the wireframes, the comps, all that stuff that I rely on to do my job isn't their end goal. This is just the documentation of their end goal, and their end goal is that interaction. Designing that interaction. For them, it's really not all that much different than a functional specification is for us. So, by shortchanging that, by not understanding these different processes, we're doing kind of the same thing. Sorry for the little quote there. Salesperson.
Right. Welcome away.
So, why is it hard to launch a website, right? First thing, missing teams and processes. I still see this a fair bit. As a lot of companies are becoming more mature, you're starting to see them bringing in people that are handling these roles and seeing people be more assertive, but you still have cases where a site goes live with virtually no analytics, or a site goes live and someone says, oh, hey, by the way, we haven't updated all of our campaign tracking, so all the old legacy data that we got, it's gone. So just missing that stuff. A lack of healthy tension. And, healthy tension sounds a bit like a misnomer, but I actually think it's kind of an important concept. And we'll kind of get in. Those suspension bridges, if you got too much tension, it's gonna pull itself apart. Same thing, you don't have enough, it's just gonna collapse under its own weight. And I think a lot of times when we think about software projects and how they fail, it really is one of those two, right? You're either running against such a deadline that everybody's screaming, hurtling towards it and trying to not catastrophically fail, or you become so big and bloated that you just never end up finishing the whole thing you can't. So, and then not anticipating timelines. Again, this kind of goes back to underestimating, right? We just don't realize how much time it takes, or don't plan enough time for some of these activities that do really need to happen. So we need to make sure that we're planning to have an SEO audit before we go live. That's right. So first question is, who am I missing? Who all should be involved in this process? And, let's be honest with ourselves. We all know who's the center of the universe. AEM development really is what makes the world go round. There wouldn't be a website without us, right? Yeah, well, so does everybody else thinks that too. So, we need to be thinking about all these major players, and it does start with the business, right? Ultimately, if you don't get buy-in from the business, if you don't get support, involvement from the business, your project's going to be very difficult to succeed. So, having your stakeholders identified, knowing who's really like running support for you is really important, because, when everybody's looking for questions and support and all that sort of stuff, you'll have one or two people that may be sitting there and wanting to help. As soon as someone says, let's criticize this, it'll be like a stadium. Everybody's going to be screaming. So you're going to need both all that help and then someone to run interference for you when you actually, go live and finish up. So first up, and little silly names, but high atop the ivory tower of strategy, you've got folks like myself, creating enterprise strategy, information architecture, solution architecture, and then running the overall program management. So this is the top level things. Really, our involvement throughout the whole project is going to be heavy early on, but we want to be involved, right? I still do code reviews pretty regularly. I still get involved in the Scrum process because it's important, right? It's important to make sure that as the development's going on, that it's in sync with the original plan, or the plan is adjusted, and that it's in sync with best practices. So, sometimes it's really easy to say, well, the architects and that sort of thing aren't involved in the project. We're just going to do something, and making sure that that's still important. They're still involved. Dancing off in the green fields of design. So, we have our researchers, which are using, and again, this kind of goes back to a fundamental misunderstanding I had to have designed is that you start off with research. So the researchers are using qualitative and quantitative analysis to look at the current site, to look at the environment, to look at all this stuff, and essentially producing research on how the user experiences should work, which then gets picked up by your UX designers. Oh yeah, no, I got that right. UX designers, which are designing the experience, and finally UI, which actually produce it into something that you can see visually, a final comp, which then gets into HTML, which you can actually use for our AEM implementation. So there's a flow there, and this whole process, where I've seen it go wrong, is it either gets shortcut or they're not held accountable, right? And so we need to, there's two different ways that can go, and making sure that we're involved in that process so that what's done is implementable and it's done in a time frame that makes sense, is really important. Deep down in the content mind, we have the content strategists, asset and content creators, who are all going to be generating the content, the assets, all that we're going to be using on the website. And so, again, when we're talking about involvement, we need to make sure that what we're creating from a component perspective makes sense from an authoring perspective. Because, a lot of times, I personally want to make sure, well, this component only allows this type of thing. It only allows a link of this type, right? But if we want to be able to create links to PDFs, we handle that. If we want to create external links, we handle that. If we want to have 45 characters instead of 44, we handle that. Making sure that what we're creating from a component development perspective fits the content strategy is, really important, because it's going to bite us later on if we do it wrong. So
that gets into content models.
It does get into content models, and so yeah, and this is where I've seen a lot of things go wrong if you don't have that content consideration up front. Is if you're just creating components based on either here's what we already had, or here's what fit into our earlier database, you're going to make a lot of assumptions that probably aren't valid. So sitting down and doing that content strategy helps, helps alleviate that, and helps understand not just how things work or how the business wants to present things, but how consumers are going to be consuming the content. As we hope. Off on the island of digital marketing. So this is where I kind of sit somewhere in between these two, right? I'm involved in the digital marketing side of things. I do a lot with Adobe Analytics and Adobe Target, as well as AEM. And a lot of times, because the digital marketing teams more often than not aren't 100% involved, right? They've got multiple sites they're dealing with, or they've got a lot of different priorities from email to web to all that. There is a tendency to not be as involved or to come in late. And so, again, it's about bringing people, making sure that they're involved. And, they're focusing on things like accessibility, SEO, search engine optimization, search engine marketing, analytics, and, personalization or conversion rate optimization. These are all different digital marketing activities. They're really going to be critical, especially after the site launches, but we've got to do work ahead of time to make sure that we support. And finally, Fortress of Technology. So, this is where we do all of our work around development, integration, search, all the different stuff that we do as part of it. So this all makes sense. I don't want to make sure I'm not, going too fast, too slow, or off track here. So.
What does CRO mean on your lower right?
Sure. So that's conversion rate optimization. So that'd be a combination of testing and personalization. So a lot of the theme of this talk is going to feel like this, but it really is about thinking outside the box, right? So we need to make sure that we're including the right teams at the right time, and collaborate and compromise. And so, where I've seen this go wrong is when we come to a team, we say, hey, we did this. We're doing this. I don't want to say that we need to all be kumbaya, that everybody needs to be like, yeah, we're just going to take whatever requirements we get. But there needs to be collaboration, there needs to be compromise, which means both from when we run into problems, we got to come with solutions. And then when other teams are running into problems, we need to be willing to flex. Because otherwise, it's just inviting people to meetings that they don't want to go to. And then, be curious and engaged. So one of the comments I heard over and over again when I'm talking to people, and I talked to several dozen people within the company around different disciplines, was, we really do like this stuff. We like learning about it. Digital marketers, designers, they're curious people. And so they actually really like understanding how this works. So, whenever we run into problems, that sort of thing, I should say whenever, when we run into problems that pertain to other groups, bring them involved. People are actually really happy to do that. And that's one of the things that I've changed and tried to become a little bit more involved with, or better practitioner of myself, is bringing people in, because they really, as a whole, like that. So, one pet peeve of mine, though, a lot of times when you get a project manager in particular that is trying to be collaborative, that means 20 people in every meeting, right? You have someone for SEO, SEM, analytics, target, AEM, content, et cetera, yada, yada, yada. So do you really need that? I mean, obviously the answer is no. So it's about including the right people at the right time, knowing what's coming next, having that. So one of the concepts that actually one of the designers was talking about when I was talking to her was a healthy tension. And it sounds kind of counterintuitive, right? Tension on projects is not a good thing. But, like, that bridge metaphor fits. I think that you have to have a certain amount of tension between different groups. Otherwise, you end up either just tearing apart, the whole thing, falls apart, or it just collapses in on itself. And the reason for that is that, we're always working with finite resources. Biggest company, biggest budget, it's still never going to be quite as much as you want. And you're never going to have quite as much time as you want, and you want to as many people as you want. I mean, guaranteed. It's like that. It's like the purse. When you get a bigger purse, it fills up. When you get a bigger garage, it fills up. When you get a bigger basement, I'm still chucking stuff that I don't know why I had So there's always going to be limits. We're always going to be working within limits. And the ideal scenario, is this healthy tension where everybody's working together. And, honestly, I think that there are cases where that's not true, especially, some of you that worked in corporate environments. You have either the people that will succeed individually at the cost of everyone else, or are, passively or actively sabotaging projects. Little story time. I was in southern Italy at one point. It was a Franco-Italian company, and we'd spent 2 days talking about how we were deploying this Amazon Web Services-based solution. I've been working with the IT group, which is all out of Italy. At the end of it, one of the Frenchmen stood up and says, as a corporate policy, network solutions does not allow us to use cloud services, and sat down. 2 days of meetings, he was sitting there. And so they just kicked everyone out of the room. You could hear the screaming from down the halls. Having that want to succeed together is important, and it's not always. Each team is going to come in with a different perspective, and that's a different perspective of success, right? So personally, what I want to see is a site that has really good uptime, really good performance, that's easy to author, easy to maintain. I'd like it to be dynamic. I was tired of building static websites. I want to build something kind of cool and snazzy. A designer is going to come in with a very different perspective, more around the users, to be honest, because I like cool technology. Your SEO people are going to care about making sure that it shows up well in rankings. Analytics wants to make sure that we're tracking users, that they can report on it and they can show success. So all these different perspectives aren't necessarily in conflict, but they're different perspectives on what it looks like to be successful. And so in order to make this all work, to have that healthy tension, we need to compromise, right? And I think to do that, we need to kind of understand where people are coming from, what their perspective is. So, what really makes these different groups tick? How do they think? How do they approach their work? What are their goals? What is success like for them? And then why is that important as part of the project? So, starting at the top, you get your information architecture and taxonomy. I'm kind of grouping two related topics together. But to do that process, really, it starts with goals. So, when you're designing a new taxonomy, when you're designing an information architecture, you try to understand what the goals are and the use cases. So, one of the things that was kind of interesting to me as I was talking through Dan Taxonomy is he was talking about, it's a completely different use case for how you set this thing up if you're using it for web or if you're just using it for pure asset script. I've done a lot with workflows around that, but I've never really sat down and talked about how you actually structure the content, because to me, it's just a box that you put things in and then somewhere else, right? So for them, this is really, for a taxonomist, this is really important. Understanding how it's going to get used, because it allows you to develop the structure. What makes sense to structure these assets, that they're easy to find, that they're easy to search for, all that sort of stuff. And so that defines the structure and the metadata for the assets or for the content or the data. Goals here, makes sense. Organization, right? Ease of use, simplicity. So one of the things that, I'm just going to pull it up real quick. One of the things he said is that a good taxonomy is easy to teach, easy to use, and easy to understand. Right, and those are the goals you're kind of balancing, right? Because as you pull in lots and lots of content, keeping that organized, keeping that structured, keeping it easy to find things, and then making it so that any Joe Schmo can come in and find something is not easy. It's not an easy task to do that with hundreds of thousands of images or terabytes of content. And so why this is important to us. I'm sure you've been on projects where you've been asked to just set up a site structure, right? And it's not an easy thing to do. It was kind of created ad hoc. And so having a dedicated IA and taxonomy really defines that content structure ahead of time, instead of having to do it ad hoc. And then it helps organize things. You know, as developers, I think we're a little bit more comfortable with complexity than I think your average user. So, you know, a good example of this that I've seen before is that, you know, having magic folders. So if I put an image in here, then it magically does this other process, and then it, you know, goes out on the website on this location. I totally get that. But from an IA perspective and from a user perspective, that's like completely unintuitive that I have to do this process to get something on the website under. So having that taxonomist come in and talking to them about that, it actually talked me off a ledge earlier, doing something very similar on a project. So, user experience and design, you know, these are actually pretty similar overall to processes. So again, starting with goals, understanding the environment. And this is where the design process is actually a lot more involved again than I think I really understood. So by the environment, they really mean everything from the brand, their history, their customers, their competitors, you know, all of that. What's out there in the marketplace, doing comparisons against other companies. There's a lot of research that goes into that, and that all leads to planning and interaction. This is really, you know, I was talking to them, I kind of thought that this right here, documented plan, the workflow or the work wireframes and all of that was like the important part. That's what they really get excited about, is planning and interaction, understanding how people use the system, or use, you know, whatever it is you're building, and then testing that, you know, doing iterative tests on that to improve that. So goals, and these are actually kind of two different things here, right? So one of the quotes that kind of made sense to me is a positive emotional connection. And this is what, you know, your UI designers are really going for, right? They want that Disneyland, right? They want, when you go on that site, when you use that app, to go like, oh, I'm home. This is great, right? Your UX designers are looking for clarity and simplicity, right? So they want it to be the Mac experience. You know, it's got one button. It just does everything that you want. It is so simple to use that no one even has to ask questions. They just look at it and know what to do with it. And so together, you know, that's really, I think, what drives all user experience and design, and that balance there of, you know, beauty and that positive emotional connection, and that attraction to something, and making it as simple as understandable as possible. And, you know, I mean, obviously there's the importance of, well, you got to have design to actually implement something, right? You don't, if you're, I've made a few websites personally, and they are the worst things from a design perspective ever. You know, big white screens with nothing on them. But beyond that, you know, having a good design, spending time on design, making sure that it's well refined, really helps with your own functional specs, right? Because, you know, a really good design team, what they'll be doing is as they add in all these things, they'll say, well, you know, if we do this in this particular context, then it's going to do these 5 different things. And so having that baked ahead of time means that I've got to ask a whole heck of a lot less questions later on. And then it's that, you know, user experience, right? I'm sure you've all been to a website where you can tell that there wasn't a strong design team, you know, and anything in like the semiconductor space in particular is one that I've done some work with. And, you know, it's very technical, it's very dense, very cluttered. Having that user experience design involvement helps make sure that mitigate that problem, make your user experience more usable. Any questions so far? I mean, you know, I don't feel like I'm going on. So SEO and digital marketing, again, you know, they're talking about determining goals, right? Understanding the environment, and then creating a measurement and optimization plan. For Adobe Analytics, generally we call this an SDR, or solution design reference. But it's essentially the plan of how to implement the tracking for your website, how to implement the personalization, whatever it happens to be. And that plan isn't necessarily a technical plan. It's more high level about, when I click on something that looks like this, I want to trigger this action or this event so I can track it. And then it's all about validating and assessing. So, usually during the average, analytics project, we end up spending, a third of our time just testing it out under different scenarios, because usually there's going to be more things that will come up from a tracking perspective or more edge cases. From a goals perspective, digital marketing is looking to optimize more than anything. The reporting, they'll help with the reporting and all that, but it's really about optimizing the experience and mitigating loss from changes. This is one that kind of came up. So, especially when you talk about SEO and CRO, so that when you launch a new website, it can really be devastating to your page ranking if you're not being careful about how you do search engine optimization, making sure that you maintain links, making sure that you're well tagged and metadata, all that sort of stuff. And then same thing when you make design changes, it can just kill your conversion rate on your website. The number of people that are signing up, that sort of thing, if you're not testing it ahead of time, and then if you're not testing it on an ongoing basis. I think there's a classic story of Amazon removing the login button before checkout and making those gobs of money. There was like $15 million back when they were just selling books. So, that sort of testing is really what drives digital marketers, is being able to find those kind of gotcha insight moments. So, important, it measures the success of the program, right? When I first started doing websites and that sort of stuff, we really didn't do all that much analytics, and it's kind of like you just hope that it worked. And being able to say, hey, we did this much better, we did this much worse. We had this many more people, we got these many more signups. Obviously that's how you justify the spend, right? And then it allows you to do ongoing improvements. So, when you launch, that's not the end of it at all. You need to keep evolving the websites, you need to keep evolving apps, you need to keep evolving these digital marketing programs, because if you just let them stagnate, they'll wither and die. You've got to redo it again in a couple years. So as a client or as a system integrator, you really should be going for ongoing improvement. The second you're done with launch is testing, improving, and restarting the cycle. Yeah. Yeah, and
strategies around how to approach that.
Yeah, there is. So one of the just silly ones is that when you're creating a component in AEM, if you're going to be personalizing, you actually got to be careful about how you do JavaScript, because you need to have your JavaScript, if it runs on page load, you need to be able to have some event to trigger it, because otherwise your component won't render properly when it's targeted. And same thing, like one of the problems that I've seen in the past is when you're doing personalization, you want to be able to give every variant a reasonable name. And so in your components, you want to be able to expose a little bit of metadata that says, hey, I'm variant 1, 2, 3, and have that flow through, because otherwise your tests, it's difficult to determine from your tests what's the one that's actually doing the best. So, having that stuff in mind is good when you're designing your components, because you'll just need a few more fields, which is easy to do when you're developing it versus a total pain in the ass to put in, when you're right about to go live. Another really common one is analytics. So when you're doing forms on a page, you really always want to give those a unique ID. You want to give them a unique ID. Some meaningful ID. This is the contact us form. This is the contact us form variant 2. This is the contact us form variant 4, or this is the lead form, because it'll make the analytics team's job a whole heck of a lot easier. Because then they can just say, hey, grab the form with this, and then that's a contact form event versus a lead form event versus a purchase event versus a whatever event. So having that SDR in hand before you start your implementation and knowing some of those things that they're going to want to do, you can make it a lot easier for yourself and them to just write out a data. That's all you really need to do for most of these. Excellent. So content strategy, and hoping I got this right here. So, it starts with the brand and consumer definition, right? So content strategy is based largely around consumer perceptions. And then, going to goals and needs. And why I say both goals and needs is that you have consumer needs and then you have business goals, and those may not be the same thing. Think about a hospital, right? And maybe Africa. But a hospital is going to want to talk about, we have the best doctors, we do all these different things, we do all this stuff. The consumer wants to know, I'm bleeding. How do I get to the hospital? Right? And
why are you the best doctor?
Yeah. But so there's two different things there. There's the message that the brand wants to get across and the message that the consumer wants to hear. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're not, and it's about balancing those things. And designing a communication strategy or a strategy that allows you to communicate those messages, right? That are not always quite the same. One of the other important things is doing that inventory of content, right? Because you got, whenever you come into something, you've got content that you're going to want to create, content you want to delete, content you want to merge, and content you just want to update. And so that process of doing an inventory. A lot of times I've seen projects where you just do straight migrations of content from one system to the other. It's not it's not the best strategy, right? Because as you're going through, you can usually eliminate something, you can clean something up, and doing that as you're doing the migration is going to save effort versus pulling something in and then coming back, which may never end up happening. And then finally, the actual process of doing the authoring and the migration. So, usually there's going to be some technical aspect there, but every time I've ever done a migration, there's always some effort to clean up, to audit, to, fix links, whatever it happens to be. No matter how automated we try to make things, content is a beast that can't always be controlled. And if you pull it into a different system like AEM, it's going to have formatting issues, that sort of thing you're going to have to clean up. So from a goals perspective, it's to be an advocate for the consumer and create the content that the consumer is looking for. So I've talked to a couple different people, and this is really what they said, is that it's all about creating something that people want to consume, creating that engaging content, and being the advocate within the team. Because it's really easy as a technologist to be focused on the technology. Digital marketer, focus on conversions, and sometimes you just miss that consumer view. So, again, why this is important. Having a good content strategy really supports your requirements. Because if no one's taken the time to look through what's already there or look through what you need to create from a content perspective, you may end up finding, well, and it's kind of a silly one, but hey, we need to have content that displays on a 60/40 grid versus whatever grid, because we need to have a message that has a primary and secondary set of information. It also focuses your messaging a little bit, or focuses the business's messaging a little bit, externally versus internally, which helps the overall program and really helps, I think helps you a little bit when you're talking through things, right? I've actually found it's really valuable to sit through content workshops because, when I'm doing architecture, I need to think about, hey, I'm going to go back to healthcare. I probably fairly obvious reasons, but when a person comes to a hospital and they're looking to do contact the hospital, we don't know what mental state they're in. They may have just gotten a cancer diagnosis. They may be having serious problems, and we need to spend a lot of time thinking about how that interaction works and doing everything we can to make it as simple as possible. So having that strategy, this content strategy up front will help refine that.
So the content strategy, how do you manage in the system for whatever.
Yeah.
So migration context strategy that
So we're talking about versions. You know, I mean, so there's a couple ways of seeing that
So
done.
are we talking versions, or
Yeah.
are we talking about, let's say, the same content that is slightly adjusted to meet different personas?
So maybe an audit because
Right?
with every change
Yeah.
or with every audit change becomes a new word.
It's not actually not quite that. So AEM is different than, I don't know if you've all worked with like older, or some other systems like Documentum or I can't remember. Interwoven, yeah, that version automatically unchanged. AEM actually doesn't version except on specific events like activation, because versions are actually relatively expensive. So, I mean, the first thing is that, yeah, you can, you know, every time content goes live, a new version will be created. It does actually purge versions, or you can set it to purge versions, and you usually need to set it to purge versions. You want to make sure that that's set to a reasonable value. One of the things that I've actually done before, this was a site that had a lot of compliance, you know, concerns, and they actually took a snapshot of the site and saved it to tape storage, offsite tape storage, because they needed to be able to reproduce it exactly as it existed at a point of time. So you can get to that extreme. But you know, the other thing you can do is just set your version policy to a reasonable thing. One thing we did talk before too about is launches. So if you do have that case where you need to be able to create like 2 branches of content. So we have our 2017 content, our 2018 content. We're coming out with new products, or we're coming out with the new, name a thing, right? Launches are actually they're really cool, but it works a lot like live copy. You branch off the content, you make all your changes, and then when you're ready, it basically stomps back over top of that original branch of content. And those are really, really good for that. You need to maintain multiple branches, multiple copies of content, and be able to sync them back in eventually. And also, actually, live copy is good for certain cases too, where you need to have, like, let's say you're creating multiple copies of content, you want to be able to tweak it a little bit, but have most of it be the same. You know, if you're doing like different states have different regulations, that sort of thing, you can use live copy for that as well. And that'll make that easier to maintain.
So considering the migration, how will you manage all the live copy, all the content?
Carefully. Migrating versions is an interesting task. It's a challenge. Yeah, especially when you're pulling it between systems. If you're doing upgrades and that sort of thing, you know, I mean, if you could do an end-place upgrade, that's a low effort way to do it. But when it comes to migrating versions, you know, you really need a tool that will do that for you. And more often than not, I've actually seen where it's been a while since I did a project where we did a migration and kept version history, just to be frank. So.
But how about answering the other question, which is when you have, say, the same basic copy, but there are different versions that are needed for different audience types.
Mm-hmm.
What is the best way to manage that, and what is the best way to also tag it so that, you know, for SEO purposes,
right,
that it's not going to be each other, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so part of the answer could be Adobe Target. If you've got that licensed, you know, you can do segment-based personalization where, you know, essentially need to define what those segments are. So, you know, I am in New York, I'm male, I'm anything you can pick up off of either user activity, user personas, that sort of thing. And then, you know, you personalize the content based on those different segments. So, you know, it can be like a scroll down through, find the best match type thing. There's some capabilities to do that right in AEM. And if you're doing a really limited thing, you can do that as well. But it doesn't do like measurement. It doesn't, it's basic. So it's not quite as nice, but it will work too. And the nice thing about Target is in 6.3, you can actually like do inline editing of, again, the more basic stuff, A/B tests and segment personalization, but you can do that within the CMS. I think you've got to go out if you want to do multivariate. But yeah, that's getting more complicated than I think you want to do through CMS anyways. So unhealthy tension, clearly a problem. So recognizing unhealthy tension, the first thing you can have is failure, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean the whole project fails, but someone somewhere says, this was the worst project I've ever worked on, or we didn't do what we needed to do, whatever it happens to be. Obviously a problem, right? Lack of compromise, and so this is one of those things that, like, occasionally you're going to have situations where you can't compromise, but when you see over and over again either a team or a group or whatever it happens to be, just you're just running up against that, right? There's a project I was on where the design team, I probably harp on the design team a lot, but the design team just kept, no matter what, it's like, no, we've got to do this. We can't change the way this button works because, it's the best button in the whole wide world. And so, when you have that lack of compromise, that usually then leads to either a lack of breakdown, where you're having teams just not collaborating. It just doesn't make sense. So, all things to look out for. So, starting off right, making sure that doesn't happen, ensuring all teams are involved. And as developers, as architects, we can't be the person that's making that happen, but keep bringing it up, right? Say, hey, have we talked to SEO about this? Have we talked to the analytics team about this? Have we talked to these people about these decisions that we're going to be making on a daily basis? A good example of this is we were working, the client came to us and said, hey, we need to have 3 tabs, and they need to go down to anchors. And we ended up talking through that with the design team. We came up with a solution. It doesn't look the exact same, but the functionality works. And because we were able to collaborate with design, it's something we were able to do. So making sure that people are involved in those decisions and not just going off. And developing a RACI. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with RACIs because it's such like a business thing. It's a very old school document, but having that definition of who's responsible for what, even if literally it's that you write it down once, you never touch it again, is a good activity to go through. And it really shouldn't be like a project manager just doing that and then putting it in SharePoint. Like everybody needs to sit down and say, yeah, I agree to that. That is something that makes sense to me. Developing a plan up front. Again, I'm also not a waterfall person, so I very much think agile. I work agile. I've done agile fall and waterfall projects, but I like having that iterative approach. But at the same time, you need to know what you're working towards, right? You need to have a plan around the sprints that you're doing, and knowing, hey, when we reach sprint 3, we need to call up the SEO team to perform their first review so that we still have time before sprint 4 to add in any new work that they can. So having that plan and making sure that plan reflects all these other teams and their activities.
Also, that really depends on your discipline. So for content strategy, it lends itself less to agile and waterfall because, frankly, you need to have discovery. You need to have that. You even had in your own slide. If you don't have that time to get your pins all in order, you could risk things.
Yeah, and that's one of the things too is a lot of times when we're working with other teams, content strategy is that way. Design is that way to a great degree too. You can usually break designs down, but when you're working in your first launch, it's not really done until all of it's done, right? Because as you make design decisions, those design decisions may affect other things you've already created. So and one of the things we'll talk about in a minute is that having a design direction up front does help with that, but it's still not going to be perfect. So, and finally, keep the plan up to date. One of the other things I've seen too is we create a plan up front and then it goes out the window the moment we get into where you go live. So why care? And first off, just to be selfish, AEM development's late in the process. So again and again, we kind of get stuck with the bag. Whenever anybody's delayed, whenever anything is going wrong, we end up eating it. So we're all in this together. The site launches are a dozen, and we need to be cogent of what we're doing and how that affects everybody else, and what everybody else is doing and how that affects us. This illustration kind of helped me a little bit and help me communicate this to other teams too. Is that we're going through this whole process. We're going to do discovery, UX design, wireframes, comps, front end dev, requirements, and then we can actually develop. Right. So there's a lot that happens before us. And then after us too, we can't have content authoring begin until we're really done. We can't get stuff into the system until the components are created to handle it. There's a lot of content strategy that can happen ahead of them, but if we're delayed, if we're pushing out, then someone else is also taking a hit too. And same thing with testing, and auditing and all that sort of stuff. We need to make sure that we finish with time, finish 2 weeks ahead of time, so that we've got time to test and audit the site, run performance checks, all that sort of stuff before we actually go live. Yeah.
Front end dev can go front end. I mean, like, you put it in behind the AEM development, can go after AEM development.
There are certainly, I think every project I've worked on, we've started AEM development concurrently with front-end development, because there's back-end stuff that we can do, the workflows, the servlets, all that sort of stuff. But at some point, you've got to have front-end dev work to really start creating components. So it's not, none of this, of course, is we can't even, do anything. It's more the large bucket of stuff. So actually, oops, wrong way. So actually broke this down a little bit more here. You can see how there's going to be some bleed usually, but your front end dev usually does come somewhat before your AEM development really picks up speed. Of course, it depends on the project. So one of the things I think is important too is to kind of keep in mind prerequisites, which kind of feeds into this whole this whole planning and knowing what you need to do, and raising the red flag. So if you're in a project, and these are all, again, when I talk about painful learning points, these are all things that have not happened. If you don't have the race you created before you go into discovery, or before you start hardcore discovery, that's going to be a problem. People don't agree on who does what. Also about stakeholders too, so knowing who you're going to be talking to, who's responsible. And then agreement on scope. And when I say that, I don't mean like every single thing you're possibly doing, but we're building a car, we're building a house, right? There's basic understanding. Before you're creating designs, one of the red flags I've seen before is when you rush through a style guide, or you don't have a style guide before designs get created. That's a sign that you should be concerned. Because having that basis is going to be really important. And then having that information architecture finalized before you really begin on designs. This, from a hardcore perspective, you do all the research, you do all that, and when you start creating comps, you should have an idea of what your site's going to look like from a structural perspective. And then having a solution design created. So, usually as I'm creating a solution design, I'm working along with the research teams. I don't expect to be done before, that much before development starts, but before the design process starts, I should have an idea of the solution I'm creating. I should have an idea of how it's going to work, because that helps me inform the designers what the technical limitations are, right? So, we've talked to the IT teams. We know that SSO won't be available for the first quarter of the year, right? That should be things that you have ahead of time so that they don't put a login form on there that works with, their SSO provider. Implementations, it pretty much all makes sense. You got to have the designs ready, right? So you shouldn't be starting hardcore implementations and not really knowing what your design's going to look like, or have that finalized. Same thing, you should have some sort of content strategy created so that you know what you're going to be implementing from a content perspective, not just from a look and feel perspective. And then the SDR and standards for digital marketing are also going to help inform your component design. So this is really all about making sure that when you start putting, fingers to keyboard, you know what you're creating the first time, so you don't have to redo it. And then finally, go live. And this is one that I've seen, get shortchanged a fair bit, which is, again, kind of surprising, is you need to make sure that you run all the tests you should. Adobe Managed Services is actually really good about sticking to a lot of this first section here, UAT, performance security, making sure that you've done due diligence to all the technical stuff. Sometimes when you're doing internal IT, that may not be the case. But then you also need to make sure you're getting your content audit. So someone should be crawling the site, making sure that there's no dead links, that all the pages have the correct metadata, they're all tagged correctly, all that sort of fun stuff. There should be time for an analytics audit. So this is one thing that can really a huge problem, is if you don't check your analytics before you go live, and you lose out on 12 hours of your launch traffic. I mean, that can be a huge problem, because you can't really recover it, right? And same thing with search engine optimization. So, crawling the site and looking at it from not just perspective of the content itself, but how it will perform on the site, making sure that there's no missing redirects, that sort of thing. I don't know, timeline here, this will be posted online, but this is really what I found after talking to a bunch of people about what they think, we need to have from a time frame perspective when we're accounting for these different things. So as you're putting together a project plan, these are kind of rough baseline numbers, they're almost all ranges, but it's really, hey, if I was just going to slot this together, if I was going to throw together a proposal, I was going to throw together a project plan, this is what it would look like, more or less. Sorry. And then this is where we come down to, so this is laid out based on that. This is, yeah, I can do that. Sure. And this is just kind of an example project plan. So, very high level, but, this is, I think, an average AEM project is something like this. I think it comes up to just over 12 months, or 6 months. And it all depends on your scope, right? It can be huge. I've done projects that are a month long. I've done projects that are a year and a half long, right? And it just depends on how much you're doing, how much you're launching, how many different launches you have, all that sort of stuff. But this is probably your average AEM setup project. It's, 6 months from the beginning to the end, starting with the designs all the way to getting a site live. And then, importantly, as our analytics team keeps telling me, checking it after it goes live to make sure that we didn't screw it all up. And one thing I did want to call out here too is that, as we're continuing through the implementation, really need to make sure that we keep the architecture and strategy, and then also design teams informed. And this is part of the reason it's nice to work on that kind of end-to-end solution, but having the ability to bounce things off the design teams really does, I think, help a lot as we're developing components, as we're developing code, as we're developing solutions, because we know, we can draw on their research, on their understanding of the consumer, and make sure that they're not going to be PO'd later, and they find out that we've done something that's, horrible from a UX perspective. So really, the 3 takeaways of the whole talk, just wrapped up here, is collaborate, think outside the box, bring an actual clicker, keep that healthy tension, and then plan ahead, planning for all these eventualities. So thanks. I appreciate everybody, coming. And any other questions or talk about anything else?
I agree with all the content strategy. So the only thing is, I would say the content strategy actually comes the process for the IM.
Yep.
Just need to
Define the strategy. Yeah.
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 So the content models and all of that before it gets to UX and wireframes.
Yeah, this is unfortunately developers who have a lot of this stuff, so I'm more than happy to take reference because and essentially to prepare for this talk, I kind of, this has been something I've been bouncing around for a while. I ended up sitting down with well over a dozen people and just talking through how this different perspectives on this on different projects that either went really well or really poorly. Which is educational for me because I get to talk about things that I could do better at, or proficiency Adobe team in general could do better at, and then where things went really well.
Dan?
Yep.
Hey, you have 3 questions in the Q&A of Zoom.
Okay.
So I don't know if you can see the control panel. If you look under Q&A, you'll see 3 questions that you could probably entertain.
I'm not sure I can. Carlos, would you mind just reading them off?
Sure. I was gonna offer that. Okay, so question number 1 comes from George Carlisle. Do you feel the Adobe AEM certification tree prepares you to satisfy customers? Personally, I struggle with the upfront paperwork, document design, etc. I've started using storyboards to move the discussion forward faster.
So, yeah, I mean, most of the Adobe certifications are kind of geared, I think, more towards developers. The architect exam, does cover a lot of that, but it's not necessarily from the perspective of the overall end-to-end solution. What I do know is, I don't remember who we're working with Adobe, but there is an active effort right now to a little bit better define what a good solution design is for AEM. And there is some documentation that exists out on the documentation website, and I think that there's going to be a new version of that coming soon. That I'm definitely hoping. We're providing some feedback. I know they've reached out to other system integrators to know what they're doing, and I hope that the next version of that will be a better starting point for that. When it comes to the big document versus the storyboards, usually the way I do that is that I break everything down into storyboards, or Kanban boards, or whatever you want to call it. But it does usually get rolled up into a single document, so the document's broken down by sections. Because starting with a 40-page document is an exercise in frustration.
All right, there's 2 more questions. They're not. I don't think they're directly related to what your talk, but I could still ask them if that's okay. Okay. Also from George Carlisle, have you started to use Adobe XD to do design? I've started using the tool, but the ramp up is high. Lots of assets need to be created for UI/prototyping. A project can be bogged down with creating assets. So it's about Adobe XD.
No.
Okay. No, and then one last question, also from George Carlisle. This time, can you put more definition around this? I'm not sure what that's referring to. Is this for a domestic or multinational deployment? I guess I'm not sure what that refers to. I don't know if George, if you're still online, can you clarify your question before we go? Oh, the timeline he talked about. So he's referring to the timeline. Is it domestic or multinational deployment?
Usually that sort of timeline would probably be reflective of either just a nationality or a region within an international deployment or a single regional deployment. when it comes to deploying solution across multiple regions, it looks kind of differently because you usually have that big upfront piece and then it's kind of stamping it out across multiple regions. It does depend on how the company is structured and how they want to go about doing their business, because sometimes it's either like very regional based or sometimes it's more central authority. But this would be like an initial implementation of a single region.
Awesome, thank you.